Lin Manuel Miranda's mega hit, the musical Hamilton, has got hip-hop in it. You can't miss that. It's what makes it distinctive, and most Broadway shows don't even come close to trying to put something like hip-hop or rap in it. Loren Kajikawa put it this way, quote, Hamilton's engagement with hip-hop's history, culture, and aesthetics forms an undeniable part of the musical's appeal. Hamilton deserves to be called a hip-hop musical. But that raises some questions. Some of the traditional themes of hip-hop music aren't exactly empowering for women, or maybe anyone. There's also a fair tendency to celebrate violence, especially gun violence. Is that inherently a part of the hip-hop genre, or a sideshow? Or is it merely all a metaphor? Or is it just true of some songs and not others, or what? And there's clearly a cultural element to hip-hop, but what is it? Where did hip-hop come from? What does it mean? And when all those questions are answered, it all adds up to one big question for the show. What does using the hip-hop style of music add, take away, confound, or enhance about the show? Does it make the show work? Does it detract from it, or does it not really matter at all? And when you listen closely, is most of the music really hip-hop? Get your gin, get your juice, sit back, and let's get our music history on in this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.
I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production and go into a deep dive on the questions that it raises and the answers that it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life. And I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected.
Okay, we're going to get on with the episode in just a sec, but as always, I want to take a moment to thank everybody who's listening to this. Musical theater is a genre, maybe a subgenre. The history part of that is smaller, and the audience that wants to hear about the history and original academic research, that's pretty high-end and involves some abstract concepts. Well, that is an elite group of humans, and you're one of them, and you're spending your time listening to this, and I am deeply appreciative. To keep the show going, of course, as always, if you could give it a rating on your favorite podcast listening site, or even better, share an episode on your social media. That will help us out a bunch. I'm going to save the deeper pleading here, but I just wanted to let you know that if you're taking the time to listen to this, I really like putting these shows together, and I'm glad that you're listening to it. Coming up, we're going to have some trivia quizzes. I've been teasing those for a little bit, but there's a couple of them out there on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go to the Theater, History, and Mysteries YouTube channel, you can find the very first quizzes about Hamilton there. The formatting of the quiz is actually a little bit funky, so we're tooling with that, but we are hoping within the next 2 weeks to get out a whole quiz series that you can take all these episodes that you're listening to, take a trivia quiz about them, or go the other way around. See how you can do on the trivia quiz and then come back for the full episodes. But at any rate, it's something I hope is going to add a little bit of fun to the show, maybe get a slightly larger audience going on. And if you, challenge your friends, talk some trash at your local, hangout place, see if other people can catch your quiz score, that'd be great. Okay, so as we jump into this topic, we're going to hit a bunch of topics in this episode. Today, we're talking about the hip-hop element of Hamilton, of course. And we're going to hit a bunch of topics that we've already have some past episodes where we've had entire episodes dedicated to them. So the hip-hop component of the show is definitely going to touch on gender. It's going to touch on race. It's going to touch on multiracial casting. It's going to touch on that whole neoliberalism capital issues. Now, all I can say right now is if you have not heard the past 10 episodes, that might be worth going back to give those a listen. I will give the 2-minute version, so everything you need to know, or I guess the bare minimum to make it coherent, what we're going to talk about here when we talk about gender bod. For instance, the last episode, everyone seemed to like it. It was about the women and their portrayal in Hamilton. That covered more of a focus on all those characters and their historical places. Today, we'll just talk about how hip-hop intersects with questions of female representation, but that's just a for instance, so that as we go through this hip hop thing, we've also had past episodes on multiracial casting, on whether or not Hamilton owned slaves, on Hamilton as the founder of the United States Treasury and the role that he played in United States capitalism. All of those have been treated before. give them a listen if you have not yet done so, or just be aware that as I rush through all those topics briefly in this episode, there's more a couple episodes back if you want to hear it. This is also a pretty selective treatment of the literature. There is more about this topic than I'm going to cover today. There's a whole bunch of books and other articles talk about it, so my apologies if I'm leaving out something important, but in my defense, there are lots of things with topics like hip-hop and Hamilton that get you all excited with the title, and then you actually read them and they have very little about hip-hop. So I kind of stopped wading through all the titles that might have been relevant. But I will say everything I'm about to talk about, all the researchers here have something to say that I did find to be important. So let's dwell more on what we do have than what we don't, just like every family that is without money has hold their children forever. But I do think what we have here is going to be valuable. I'm going to have fun with it. I hope you do too. And so our agenda is we will first talk about the history of hip hop. Then we'll talk about how it is used in Hamilton. And then we'll explore what scholars have written about this show and its use of hip hop. And that'll get us through this episode. So topic number one, what is hip hop? Now, here I'm going to rely on two sources primarily. One is John Blinko. That's an audio engineer who wrote a pretty useful, concise summary that had footnotes. So you know that there was more to it than just a guy who's really good at audio talking about what might have been true of hip hop. And also Derek Aldridge and James Stewart, who are from the University of Georgia and Penn State, respectively. They were writing in the Journal of African American History. And then my third source is just for the broad strokes. I took a look at Wikipedia just to make sure I had things in order. Wikipedia, of course, I think I've mentioned before. I was revolted when it came out. How dare the internet put all these unqualified sources out there. But as time has gone on, it's proved to be a pretty reliable source of information, and at least and better than most of the partisan news sources. So anyway, those are the three places that I went to track down this history of hip hop. Now, going way back, blues is, of course, emerging in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, right as we're starting to be able to record music. That then gives way to rock music by the 1960s, and Fullerton's own Leo Fender made a significant contribution to rock and roll, and he started manufacturing electric guitars. Your Fender guitars are from right here in Fullerton, California, the home of this very podcast, and the location of Cal State Fullerton, where I currently teach. Anyway, blues becomes rock and roll by the 1960s and 1970s. In the mid to late 1970s, rock turns into disco, and of course, there's kind of some hair band going on. But that's kind of the music scene in the 1970s. The dance portion of it is mostly disco. And then in the 1970s, in the Bronx, there had been white flight, so that the north part of the Bronx and in Manhattan is starting to gentrify. But in the southern Bronx, there is a concentration of African American, Latin American, Caribbean, working class folks. It's a poorer area. It's a tougher area. And it is here where hip hop is born by all accounts. Everyone can identify that part of New York City is where hip hop first takes off. The music itself is based on instrumental breaks. Now, traditional rock music swells up into a chorus. Like usually you're drumming along, there's a chorus, there's a singer singing a melody, then there's a big drum fill, and then more instruments are added, and everything gets a little bit louder, and then you're in the chorus, the music swells up. But in hip hop, the music cuts out at the end of lines or in the end of choruses. The music just stops playing altogether, and it's mostly just lyrics that come over the top of it. Now, that's not, of course, true of every single rap track or every single rap song, but it is characteristic. It's something that it's a new sound, and that's what is getting played. Those breaks in the music give rise to break dancing, and there are DJs and rappers. So that the overall style is, of course, it heavily relies on record scratching. It's a new sound you can make by scratching records back and forth on the old vinyl albums. And the vocal style is rapping, and that's where there's lots of words that are read really fast, that have clever lyrics. They focus on one-upmanship. They've got a lot of bravado in them. Some of the early stuff in the 1970s seems pretty innocent compared to what is on the radio now, but that's what it is. The style is way less about musicianship. If you're listening to Led Zeppelin or most rock music, you're going to have some guitar hero who can shred and rip off these really long riffs. And of course, classical music has always relied on great musicianship. And the hip hop style is way less about being able to play your instrument super well and way more about vocals, to the point where at the most important moments of the song, the music cuts out entirely and it's just the vocals. And what that does, it allows anyone with a boombox to put down some basic drum sounds and some basic backing music and rap over the top of it, because the important part is the rap music and the lyrics. And you could add 2 or 3 different people talking at the same time or speaking over each other or emphasizing certain words. But that's the new style that's coming out in 1970s. It's big at dance clubs, but also block parties with DJs. Now, it is hard or difficult to trace a single origin. Here, I'm going to shout out to my man, Sebastian Major. He's got that terrific Our Fake History podcast, and there's a famous story about Robert Johnson, who is a blues musician. He was the guy who played. The great mythical story is he had to play his guitar against the devil or traded his soul to the devil for the ability to play the guitar, terrific, depending on the version of the story. Anyway, in that podcast, over a couple episodes, Sebastian Major just tries to figure out who was the first blues musician and even who was the real Robert Johnson. And both are almost impossible questions to answer. So the story, and I'm not going to say it's anything more than that, it's almost impossible to say this is the exact moment when hip hop started, but there is one guy named DJ Kool Herc, who is a very key player in the whole thing. He played at his sister's back-to-school party on August 11th, 1973. There's a specific address where the party was held. It was like in the recreational room of her apartment. And that has been, the phrase I've seen is aggressively marketed as the birth of hip-hop, that there are people who will trace the entirety of the hip-hop movement to DJ Kool Herc being a DJ at his sister's back-to-school party, aggressively marketed almost to the point where it seems like people are trying to make it. That's the one place it started. It probably didn't. DJ Kool Herc himself was from Jamaica, which he both initially denied and later embraced, which also confuses the story. And I mention all of this stuff simply to say that that hip hop music came from this kind of poor area in the Bronx. It came out of places like a DJ playing a block party. And depending on who you read, maybe it started at that specific party, but definitely it was part of what was going on in that part of the Bronx at that time, that there were lots of dance parties. They were held outside. Sometimes they were held in tunnels. They were held in parties. They were held in dance clubs. But this whole music scene was developing around this new sound, this hip hop sound. And the music itself had a code that prized truth and ingenuity over mimicry, but also, strangely, remixed a whole bunch of stuff. And that will actually become important in the Hamilton show. It's this new type of music. And if you're going to be Led Zeppelin, right, what makes a great rock song? We got to have a wicked guitar riff, maybe a singer who can really belt it out, and something with a lot of energy. In hip hop music, what you had to do was say something that was new and ingenious, and it couldn't just be derivative. You had to be different and unique, but it was okay to remix all kinds of music samples from a whole bunch of different places. Okay, that gave rise to, if you were a hip hop historian, and there are many ways to do it, but at least one way is between 1973, whenever it is hip hop started, to 1983. That is called the old school era. So it's old school hip hop. And kind of the epic moment in that movement was the Sugar Hill Gang in 1979 had a hit called Rapper's Delight. And that came about because there was an artist who went by the name of Chic, C-H-I-C, had a hit that was called Good Times, which was recorded by Sugar Hill Records. So Sugar Hill Records created what they called the Sugar Hill Gang, recycled a bunch of that music, took all those Good Times instrumentals, and then just rapped over the top of them. And that also became a hit. The Rapper's Delight in 1979 is sort of a high water mark for that old school era. But now there's commercialism, so there is the possibility of selling out. I'm not saying that Curtis Blow did that, but I will say that Curtis Blow released a track called The Breaks in 1980, and that was the first certified gold hip-hop single. Now we've gone from these are block parties and things that are kind of popular amongst the niche of these dance clubs in New York to it's breaking through on the national charts and you can get a gold record out of it. Okay, I'm nerding out there. I'm going to back myself off a little bit. So from 1983 to 1986, it moves from old school to new school. And that's got artists like Run DMC and LL Cool J. And I will say, when I was in high school, seeing that Aerosmith Run DMC mashup video really was the first time I ever saw anything like hip hop. But you could tell that meant that this was a new genre that was entering the mainstream. So we go from old school to new school. Now, 1987 to 1997 is now called the Golden Age. And that is where bands like Public Enemy, gangster rap emerged with the NAA. There was an explosion of different hip hop styles. Both George Bush and Bill Clinton got into debates with Sister Souljah about whether or not what was happening in this musical movement was even okay, because it was very aggressive, maybe even militant. And this is when Afrocentrism emerged as kind of a central theme. That Curtis Blow is many things, but he was not Sister Souljah, right? He had songs like Basketball and The Breaks. But now we have NWA, we have songs like F the Police and Public Enemy are a big thing. And Sister Souljah, right, is like, that last name is picked intentionally, very combative. And they're articulating that African culture and the elevation of African-American culture, which had been, of course, coming out of the civil rights era. It had just been the Jim Crow era had really taken a toll on the African-American community. The civil rights era was opening up new voices and new ways of looking at it. And part of that post-civil rights era was this sound, this hip-hop that was celebrating Black culture and Black life. And here's where you get things like Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and even Cypress Hill, Los Angeles' own Cypress Hill. And, now we are in the golden age, so there's money to be made. So this introduces the question of selling out even more and racism. And I'm just going to quickly mention Vanilla Ice here. I would just want to share this story, my own brush with infamy. I was a college debate coach, and so we flew all over the country to go to different debate tournaments. And on one of our flights, I sat in the seat behind Vanilla Ice. How's that for a brush with infamy? And he spent the whole time. This was when they would come around and they'd try to sell you magazines to read on the flight. And there was a People magazine about himself, and he had to borrow money from his manager to be able to buy that. And then he sat in a middle seat and read about himself for the entire flight. Anyway, that was Vanilla Ice. Anyway, I'll just mention him here because it was a genre that celebrated authenticity and doing something original. And it definitely was down on if you could sell out or go too commercial or lose touch with your roots. And Vanilla Ice was all of those things. And so that's part of the reason he became controversial. All right, so that gets us 1997. We've done with the golden age of hip hop. As part of that, the East Coast, West Coast rivalry is emerging. The Wu-Tang Clan comes out of that. The Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur. We'll talk about what happened with all those guys in a little bit, but part of this is there's open public fights, beefs between different hip-hop artists. So that got us in 1997. Between 97 and 2007 is the bling era. It's in the 1990s. It is now, hip-hop is mainstream, and they're now Curtis Blow was the first guy who had a gold record single, and they are now making platinum albums. This is when Puff Daddy, who has gone down in flames, deservedly so, Dr. Dre, Eminem, they are emerging. These are LL, Jay-Z are now not just very successful musicians, but very successful business enterprises. These guys are getting fabulously rich. That's the bling era. Between 27 and 2014, we now enter the blog era. The peer-to-peer sharing and streaming is starting to kick off. It's called the blog era. Everything, all music is hurting because the question is, now that we have this thing called the internet, what's going to happen to music? It used to be you had to go to a record store and buy a record, or it had to be played on the radio and you'd get royalties. But what happens when everything's digital and you can just share it? Napster was the first big service that was disrupting that. But now, of course, there's all kinds of things like that. That hurt all commercial music, but there was a 21% drop in the hip hop sales. And for the first time in 5 years, but in 2005 and 2006, there were no hip hop albums in the top 10. And that was the first time that had happened in a long time. So after this bling era where everyone's getting fabulously wealthy, there is a drop off as streaming starts to happen. And then after about 2014 up till now, we are now in the streaming era. And that's where people like Lil Nas X can explode overnight. You can go from a nobody to, if you can get yourself discovered on Spotify or SoundCloud or wherever, you can go from being a guy in your basement to somebody who's an international superstar if you can just catch on in the digital world. And the digital music is also making production getting more sophisticated and way easier, so that when the DJs of the 1970s in New York, you had to splice literal audio tapes together to get the breaks that you wanted and the sound you want. And now digital music production is so cheap and easy, anybody could learn it. You can learn it on YouTube. If you dedicate a weekend, you can make a decent sounding musical track, especially if you've got some talent in something that you want to do. So the streaming era is characterized by people who you got to win the internet. And if you win the internet, now you're a music star. Digital music gets super easy to make, so tons of people can do it. And the whole genre has exploded globally. Bad Bunny, I think, is the biggest thing now. Made a big splash at the Super Bowl halftime show. There's tons of subgenres within rap, so hardcore, mumble rap. It's become such a ubiquitous musical form that the people who are really into it have very specific niches they like, but everyone can recognize what the sound is. And this 2014, this very start of the digital era, after the bling era had happened, this is where Hamilton happens. So it's not just, the record scratching of the 1970s. It's not just beat breaks anymore. We're now when Hamilton comes out in 2015 and 2016, of course, Lin Manuel Miranda had In the Heights that used plenty of hip hop music in that. But by 2014, by 2015, it was common for people to use the digital music production to get all kinds of different sounds, not just beats, not just scratching, not just, take an old Led Zeppelin track or an old Bowie track, pull the riff off and play that a lot. But you can do tons of things. You can put horns in the background of it. You could add complex piano parts and rap. And that's right where Hamilton breaks out. And one fun, I will not talk about this too long, but one fun college debate side note is that hip hop actually became a college debate strategy. So if you imagined, what does a college debate look like? You probably think, there's a lecture hall and then people standing at the front and it sounds like a presidential debate. And it's not really like that. It's much more like, a committee on the subcommittee on appropriations. It's super technical. They also talk super fast. That's what everyone who doesn't do debate notices, but really evidence-oriented, really technical, really competitive. And the smartest kids in the country that get into the Harvards and Dartmouths and the Texases, by God, they're super good at that. And one strategy that emerged in the 1990s, mostly led by Louisville, championed by my close friend Eddie Warner, but also adopted by other schools, including Cal State Fullerton when I was the coach there, was that we would do hip hop performances. So just imagine a debate happens where you walk in the room and Harvard stands up and reads all their evidence as fast as they can for 9 minutes. And when that's done, there's a cross-examination period. It looks like a debate. And then the other side stands up, Louisville stands up to refute them. And instead of doing anything like what Harvard had done, they hit play on a beatbox and they hip hop for 9 minutes back at them. That made for some absolutely fascinating debates. There's actually a couple different books out there. One of them is called Cross-Examination. There's a couple of videos out there you can find on YouTube. But hey, let me just say, hip hop had changed a lot of things in a lot of styles, and it intersected even with my life in college debate. Okay, that is the quick history. So let's just reflect on what did that mean. Here are some characteristics of hip hop, and here I'm relying mostly on Aldridge and Stewart. According to them, there are 4 elements of the hip hop culture. The first one is it involves a DJ. So instead of a full 4-piece band or 16-piece orchestra or whatever, you got one guy, a DJ, who's playing tracks off of a turntable. That's the first element. It involves breakdancing, it involves graffiti art, and it emphasizes rapping. And others would include a 5th category, which is that it includes knowledge, that there is knowledge being transmitted in that rapping. But as always, these characteristics are fluid. So somebody says there's 4 elements to hip hop and other people have different things. But it's useful to say it's at least got those 4 things. And I want to talk about that last one, that is knowledge and is knowledge production part of rapping. Baby Got Back? I don't know if that's like you've got something important to say to the world when you're singing about your anaconda. but definitely some hip hop songs do, and there's a political consciousness to them. And so many scholars or many artists themselves will call on the people who are producing this music to use that platform to the best ends. Daniel Banks, who wrote a chapter in a book called Hamilton History and Hip Hop, said that there is a, quote, global, youth-driven, social justice and peace-building culture of hip hop, end quote. I don't know if that is inherent to all hip hop music, but that is certainly an important part of lots of hip hop music. And a lot of people think that's what hip hop should be doing. Do more of that. So those are the, if you were to say, all right, now we know the history of hip hop, what's it like? It's got those 5 things. Great. But there are others who point out that there is a downside, a dark side, if you will, to hip hop. There's definitely some misogyny and violence. Tricia Rose, who's quoted by an author named Kajikawa, read from in the opening, and I'll properly introduce in a minute, says that there's a trinity of themes that are in hip-hop music. They are the gangsta, the pimp, and the hoe. And those are, I guess, so if you were to ask old Aldridge and Stewart, they'd say, oh, here's the 4 elements of hip-hop. But if you were to ask others, they would say, yeah, it's the gangsta, pimp, hoe. That's what they sing about. That's what most of those songs are about. And that's, of course, problematic because there's some misogyny and some violence in there. Now, there's a whole bunch of ways that you could react to the dark side of hip hop and say, okay, well, you can't really say that there is not misogyny or degradation of women in hip hop music. And you can't really say that they don't talk about violence, and especially gun violence, and especially about committing murder or killing people or beating people up. How do you react to that? One is to simply say, yes, that is what it has. That's a problem. And we need to get rid of it, or we need to remove those elements of hip hop, maybe censor them, or at least condemn them, or at least speak out against them. Others might say, well, all that stuff, that's all just metaphorical. That's not meant to be literal, and you shouldn't take it that way. Others might say, well, only the commercial hip hop, like they sell it with those themes. When we were debating this, we used to point out that a huge portion of the audience for hip hop, especially in that bling era, was white suburban males who just loved the violence and the misogyny. So yes, the commercial sellout hip hop, that was good, but there were other things, like there was a Native American hip hopper named Lightfoot, and all of that stuff was political and was deep and made a pretty good connection. So you could say, okay, well, yeah, there's some bad parts of hip hop, but that's just the bad hip hop, not the good hip hop. Another way to say is that all these allegations, all these attacks on the misogyny and violence in hip hop, that's just a way to exclude the voices, to exclude others. And Charisse Cheney suggests that it might be a distillation of all the positives and all the negatives of classical Black nationalism come together. And if you've not read the autobiography of Malcolm X, well, I encourage you to do so. Malcolm X was, of course, part of a Black nationalist movement, and that definitely had a positive impact, advancing a strong vision of what it meant to be an African American, but definitely had some downsides. And some scholars just take a look at hip hop and say, yep, you can't say hip hop is this, that, good, bad in one way or another any more than you could say that about the life of Malcolm X. And what I will conclude here is just to say, look, there's a range and there's both. There is hip hop with great political content. There is also some hip hop that is clearly just shallow commercialism that glorifies misogyny and violence. And we got to figure out how all that works its way into Hamilton. Okay, so in conclusion, I think you can say that hip hop is definitely street music. It definitely emphasizes poetry and the spoken word probably over musicianship. And it has knowledge and political content, especially because it's focusing on the message that is being said in the hip hop. It's possible for you to listen to a song, traditional rock song, and just say the melody was great, the singing was great, and the music was great, but I have no idea, but the message of the song was kind of stupid. But in rap, most of it's the vocals and what's being said. And so it almost forces you to focus on that. I will conclude here with Allison Dobrik of William Patterson University, who's mostly interested in how hip hop and its incorporation in Hamilton can be used. And so I will let her take it from here. Quote, hip-hop culture is a rich, complex, and interwoven set of expression, including rapping, emceeing, DJing, dance, graffiti, spoken word poetry, clothing styles, language, theater, and activism. In terms of its moral and aesthetic value, hip-hop culture has been described as everything from nihilistic to prophetic, empowering, and full of educational potential. Hip-hop culture continues to function as a source of identity formation and social status by and for Black and Latino young people. but it has also become a global participatory dynamic phenomenon. While hip-hop music began, in the words of CEO Russell Simmons, as a voice for voiceless poor people, the commercialization and commodification of rap have, for many, come to narrowly define hip-hop culture as a whole. All right, so there you got it. There's hip-hop that is ripe with political possibility, and there's some hip-hop that is rampant commercialism that nobody likes, but it would definitely emerge as a voice of the street. Okay, so that gets us through our first topic. What is hip-hop like? What is the history of it? Okay, so that gets us to our second major topic, and that is, how is hip-hop used in the musical Hamilton? Well, to use Kajikawa's words, and I promise I'm going to introduce Kajikawa properly in just a sec, it's the lingua franca of the musical. That is to say, it's kind of the uniting thing, the overarching way that the rest of the plot connects to each other and all the other music connects to each other. But it's got a lot of other styles too. And according to Jeffrey Sievers, who I will also introduce in a second, it's definitely got a bunch of jazz in it. Later on, we'll get to Sievers and we'll talk about all the different styles that are there. But one interesting thing is the dominant mode is definitely hip hop, but it's got a bunch of other styles that are clearly identifiable. Another interesting thing about the way hip hop is deployed in the musical is that Alexander Hamilton's lines are different. This is from Jeffrey Sievers, quote, Loren's and others start out like early 1980s rappers rhyming at the end of the line. And then here comes Hamilton. And suddenly you're getting a lot of internal assonance and a lot of internal rhyming as Hamilton formally demonstrates his intellect and ambition. And according to Kajikawa, Miranda himself claimed he, quote, wrote Hamilton with very polysyllabic rhymes like rappers Big Pun or Rakim, which showed that he was literally in a different dimension than everyone else. This is Miranda speaking. I had to prove that his intellect was to be feared in the room, end quote. So Miranda very intentionally makes Hamilton's hip hop more complex than all the other characters. And hip hop was used to draw a link between the use of words and the revolution. Again, from Sievers, quote, Miranda has said, rap is uniquely suited to tell Hamilton's story because it has more words per measure than any other musical genre. It has rhythm and it has density. And if Hamilton had anything else in his writings, it was this density, end quote. So Miranda is drawing a very direct connection between the styles of hip hop today and the use of words in the revolutionary time as Hamilton himself used them. The 10 Dueling Commandments comes directly from a Notorious B.I.G. song called The 10 Crack Commandments. And I will let Kajikawa have the last word here. Quote, the production avoids elements of mainstream hip-hop, such as abundant profanity, explicit sexuality, and conspicuous consumption that some find objectionable, end quote. Okay, so we know what hip-hop is, and we know it's got some good and bad parts. And we know that in Hamilton is given different style than everybody else is. We know that it uses a bunch of different musical styles, and that use of that emphasis on the words and the spoken word to the over music, over the musicianship, over musical complexity, that's all part of this movement. And we know that there's some, in the 10 Dueling Commandments is a critical part of the plot, and it comes almost, it is a clear and explicit reference to contemporary hip hop songs. There is a connection between Hamilton and what he was doing with words and the contemporary hip hop artists and what they're doing with words. Okay. That gets us up to speed. We know the history of hip hop now. We know how the Hamilton show deployed it. We know what its characteristics are. Let's talk about the people, the way the critics and the scholars and the experts have reacted to the use of hip hop in the show. Well, let's start with the haters. The most prominent of those is Konstantinos Valatanos. He is an assistant professor of American literature and culture at National and Kapodistrian University in Athens. As you might guess from the name, from a Greek university, but that's kind of cool, right? University of Athens, that's where the original university, way, way, way longer, more than 2,000 years ago, was originally founded. And here's what Platanos has to think. Well, Platanos thinks that for any musical, the music matters a lot. It works its way into the culture. The message of a musical gets into the culture, and it gets in the heads of the audience through the riffs and the beats. Quote, music is indeed the main vehicle by which the play seeks to attain its goals. End quote. Fair enough. It's a musical. The music matters, so that's the starting point. And the idea behind rap music is that the classic rap story is it's somebody who starts in the ghetto, they start at the bottom, and then they rise to superstardom. And one thing that Blatanus does not like is that he does not think that is true of Alexander Hamilton. He does not think that Hamilton was an immigrant as we think of immigrants now. He cites Howard Zinn. If you don't know Howard Zinn, he wrote a book called The People's History of the United States, but a very left-wing, anti-establishment, anti-great forward march of democracy approach that it talks. He points out that there's always been elites and there's always been oppressed people. That's Howard Zinn. And Blatanus cites Zinn to say that Hamilton was no outsider. He was not the marginalized. He was elite. He was one of George Washington's own aides and close confidant. But mostly he says that Hamilton, the show, lacks any depth to get to that political part of hip hop, and that mixing all those styles, all that jazz music and the other stuff we'll talk about a little more in just a sec, has the effect of totally taking the teeth out of the hip hop part. Quote, in the printed edition of the libretto, Miranda adds several parenthetical notes in which he openly states that he wrote the score for Hamilton with the desire and aspiration to establish a dialogue with such towering figures of contemporary African-American music as Tupac, Notorious B.I.G., Busta Rhymes. Yet, a careful examination of any given song in the show, and by extension, of the results that this implied dialogue yields on stage, reveals that what is being employed in this case is nothing else than the outer shell of hip-hop. In essence, the play taps into the tempo and the rhythm, as well as the current worldwide popularity of this musical idiom. It is indeed no surprise that, on almost all occasions, hip-hop swiftly transmutes here into other kinds of music, most of the well-established and widely familiar Broadway tunes. End quote. All right, that is not a glowing review. What Blatanus believes is that mixing of different musical genres is proof that the hip hop really doesn't have any substance to it, that it's really just a way to try to tap into the popularity of hip hop to get a bigger audience and then get back to what Broadway really expects, which is a bunch of Broadway standard shows. Quote, in its approach and co-option of hip-hop, Hamilton contributes precisely to the empowerment of this Broadway lingua franca, since it offers its audience hip-hop music, which is deprived, nonetheless, of its very essence, end quote. And he's not done yet. Quote, to an alarming extent, Hamilton betrays the very history of the music whose power it resorts. The musical pays no service to the unique and highly consequential trajectory of African-American music in time, and fails to address, even elementally, the ways in which hip-hop dramatizes and captures the precarious position of Black radical thought in the United States, even as African Americans have reached the highest levels of political power, veering consciously away from an exploration of the multiple ways in which music has perennially proven instrumental in probing Black consciousness. The show establishes a genuinely apolitical and ahistorical outlook regarding hip-hop. End quote. That's a lot of hate. Throw in some shade there. So it uses the form of music associated with Black consciousness, but it explores no part of Black identity, which makes that multiracial casting sort of a blackwash for a founder chic narrative, which we've talked about before. Or in other words, the show has the effect of directing attention away from racial questions like slavery, and it takes performers of color and gives them a style that is the voice of the streets, but then strips them of any political content other than falsely portraying Hamilton as an immigrant or a champion of the marginalized. So what is a characteristic of hip-hop? Well, there's clearly good hip-hop does have a political element, and it expresses an identity of marginalized people. And what Blatanus believes is that none of that is present in the Hamilton show, and he therefore judges it an oppressive failure. Now, he does conclude that the show has a political significance, especially in the Trump era, that it was clearly trying to be a progressive voice, and it's doing some inclusion at a time where inclusion is trying to be wiped off the map by the Trump administration. But Blatanus still does not like anything about the hip-hop component of the show. Okay, so that's the deepest hater. Now I'm going to turn to something that I'm going to call an apologist, not in a negative way, but just talk about the relationship to violence, because as we mentioned before, violence is frequently a theme in hip hop music, and Hamilton's using that. What is the relationship between the hip hop music? It's focusing on violence. Well, there's a guy who's thought a lot about this. It's Jeffrey Sievers from the University of British Columbia, and his entire argument goes this way. Okay, rap, there's some good, there's some bad, but the bad can creep in and swamp away the good. Here we go. Quote, rap, in creator Lin Manuel Miranda's version, is a democratic, incandescent language that those devoted to a new nation must learn in order to make political progress. But rap, in its reliance on rhetorical aggression and its embodiment on impulsiveness, also proves inadequate to the nuanced challenges of post-revolutionary life, end quote. And there are some obvious parallels between the Hamilton plot and the way hip-hop embraces violence. Hamilton, famously in the show, says he would rather be divisive than indecisive, and that ends with a violent confrontation with Aaron Burr that cost Hamilton his life. And in the, Sievers points out Tupac Shakur also famously called out rappers he didn't like, which probably led to his death. And then Biggie Smalls, the notorious B.I.G., was also murdered, probably in retaliation for the death of Shakur. And the moral for Sievers is these beefs, these calling out, this aggressive rhetoric against each other does end in violence. And that's not an okay thing. It happened in the hip hop world. It happened to Alexander Hamilton. And if you're merging those two, that's something you got to come to grips with. All right. But having set up that thesis, Sievers is also acutely aware that violence is only one angle. Here's the quote, I here regard the gun-wielding gangsta identity as simply one aspect of the multiform dramatic persona that rap MCs tend to create. Gangsta narratives boasting of violence, whether against rival gangs or police, should not be taken straight. As an audience, we have yet to condition ourselves to understand rap's tall tales as acts of projection, Adam Bradley writes in an analysis of hip-hop's literary sophistication. Rap's relation to reality is like an inside joke that much of the listening public doesn't get. The joke lies in the MC's winking assertion of the truth of obvious fictions, end quote. What? That means that you shouldn't take that hip hop literally. Maybe there's a rap artist talking about having sex with a bunch of women and tossing them aside and killing a bunch of people, but we shouldn't take any of that literally. That's not what's really happening. Now, Sean Pitty, Puff Daddy Combs proved that many times it is literal, but for Sievers, part of the way we should read hip hop, and including how it was used in the show, is that it's not always meant to be taken literally. What he points out further is that not only is hip-hop talk a whole bunch about violence and especially gun violence, but it is also a critique of violence. Quote, as Oliver Wang writes, no American pop genre celebrates the power of the gun as much as hip-hop. What critics forget is that no pop genre confronts or contends with the consequences of gun violence as much as hip-hop either, end quote. So the big thing is, it forces the characters in the show and the listeners to hip hop, and by extension, the audience, to come to grips with the effect of violence. Quote, I would emphasize that far from being a tool performing this helpful role, Biggie and much more of the gangster genre imports into Hamilton troubling issues of the politics of rap and revenge, end quote. And I will just say here, this podcast has covered the Les Miserables before. I encourage you to go back and listen to that. But the big question is not, how do you get a revolution? A revolution almost has to involve violence, but how do you effectively govern after the revolution? And there's a whole bunch of revolutions that have failed. The Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution promised to be great democracies, and then they weren't. And the French Revolution was just a mess for a century. And the United States is kind of the exception. There was a successful governance, by and large, after the revolution. And for Sievers, hip-hop is a place where gun violence is celebrated, but so are the negative effects. And so it presses the question of, you can be the biggest badass that is out there and kill a bunch of people, but they're going to come back and try to kill you. What are you going to do then? And for Sievers, hip hop presses that question. And that's the same thing that the Hamilton show presses, that, okay, Alexander Hamilton, you had this big beef with Aaron Burr and you were a soldier and you won victories and you kind of stomped over other people and you were not afraid to be divisive. But in the end, didn't that cost you your life? That question is pressed, thinks Sievers, by the show. So for Sievers, the use of rap and its celebration of violence, while also critiquing violence, proves the same point. Violence is a necessary part of the revolution, but it's not a way to build after that. Quote, the hip-hop beat sustained revolutionary actions, but the beat's collapse suggests that it was only ever a contingently reliable structure, not something around which to build a whole life. End quote. Here's another quote. Rap itself essentially grows up on stage in Hamilton, passing through a pastiche of phases as its practitioners, applying the art form to their development of democracy, learning to deploy, tame, and reflect on the music's revolutionary fire, end quote. And there's a link to Washington talking about the difference between winning the fight and governing the nation. And Miranda himself in an interview quoted Mario Cuomo, who was said to have said, it's always weird when you're trying to come up with a direct quote and attribute to one person, but Miranda attributes it to Cuomo, quote, you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose, end quote. So for Sievers, there's a very nuanced relationship between hip-hop does celebrate violence, but hip-hop also points out the problems with violence and presses the question of how does one govern effectively? And he reads the history of hip-hop as kind of going through that curve. And he says the whole show Hamilton takes that same thing. Hip-hop starts the revolution, but once the revolution is over, you've got to back off that confrontational, aggressive style. Is all that in the show? I don't know. Hamilton's death seems less a repudiation of violence than a lament that the wrong guy won. Like if Hamilton would have killed Burr, would you cheer? Or would you say, oh, I can see how bad violence is? I don't know. In past episodes, we have traced the link between honor and killing each other and what led up to that duel. Violence and the lack of compromise and beefs definitely are a theme in the show, but it's pretty ambiguous, at least in my watching of Hamilton, about whether it was a good or bad that Hamilton threw away his shot. Like Hamilton threw away his shot against Burr and he got killed. That's essentially how the show ends. Is it good or bad? Is that the point? And the point, I think, is more who lives, who dies, who tells your story. Let's learn something about the American Revolution and let's celebrate what this guy did do for the country that was positive. But I don't know that it's really, now we are forced to come to grips with what happens when there's gun violence. But that's my take. For Sievers, rap shows the good and bad of violence, and so does the duel in the show. So it's a pretty apt vehicle to use rap music to tell that story. And it was a great artistic choice. All right, so we talked about the haters. There are people who hate the use of hip hop in Hamilton. We've talked about Sievers, who's maybe more of an apologist, but definitely sees something positive there. We will now get to talk about the relationship between economics and women. Let me just introduce the author. Loren Kajikawa is the current chair of music at George Washington University, among other accolades, is writing in a journal that is called American Music. And this is awesome. Loren Kajikawa gives lectures at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. How cool is that? That's what I want to do when I retire. Lots of fun. But okay, so what Kajikawa does is talk about those negative themes that are in rap that are almost inherently there, that are part of, that trinity that others have pointed to as maybe too prominent in the themes of hip hop music. And Kajikawa is going to point out all the pitfalls and then end up on a positive side. So let's just get your brain used to the idea that a lot of what this is going to do is going to sound like Hamilton, the musical, kind of blew it in this use of hip hop, but it's going to end on a positive side. All right. So theme number one is that using lots of genres is what makes the show successful. Now, remember, Platana's thought the opposite of that. The presence of other music kind of proved that the hip hop was just a cheap commercial attempt. It was a sellout. It was not authentic hip hop. Well, what Kajikawa says is that there's a tension between appealing to a broad audience, that is someone who'd go to a Broadway musical, and a hip-hop audience who's really going to want authenticity. So that broad audience is probably going to get tuned out if it's too profane, it's got too much bragging in it, it's got too much calls to violence, it's got too much swearing, too much sex. And on the other hand, you got to appeal to a hip hop audience that's going to say, don't shy away from that. That's what we expect. You need to speak authentically. But what Kaja thinks the great success of the show is that Lin Manuel Miranda pulled it off. And Kajikawa thinks that was done by mixing all those musical styles together. And so Kajikawa emphasizes a whole bunch of musical styles that are present in there. There is a fair amount of traditionally sung music. Jefferson's tune is a boogie woogie. That Bursar riff follows a traditional 3-3-2 rhythmic foundation of Jamaican and Puerto Rican reggae. The Farmer Refuted is what Kajikawa calls Bach-like, and King George sings Britpop. That's not the full list, and I've mentioned that there was some jazz, but Kajikawa, who's a chair of music, has got a longer list than I'm able to present you with. But Kajikawa sees a whole bunch of different musical styles in there. And I don't think that's really in dispute. I guess the point is that most people think of Hamilton as a hip hop musical, but Kajikawa says there's actually a whole bunch of styles in there if you just listen to it. And Kajikawa will say that's okay. Blatanis, of course, says it's not. But for Kajikawa, the big idea is intertextuality. And that's, a $5 word that just means every song, every book, every conversation always references other books and conversations, songs. And so every individual text strings together references to a lot of other texts. And that suits this genre well because, quote, hip hop is distinct for its overt borrowing of pre-existing materials to new ends, end quote. Now that's that weird maybe contradiction, tension at least, that hip hop thrives on authenticity. You want to be a hip hopper, you got to be authentic. But on the other hand, there's a long history of borrowing from other genres, famously Vanilla Ice stole a Bowie riff on his Ice Baby song, but also the Beastie Boys used the Led Zeppelin track, and it's just common to sample different musical phrases to put in your hip hop music. So for Kajikawa, that is intertextuality, and that is typical of the borrowing. And Kajikawa thinks in this case it leads to success. Quote, Elizabeth Craft explains, Hamilton transcends traditional party divisions in part because its plot and the founder's myth on which it is based remain open to multiple readings and interpretations along both conservative and liberal lines, end quote. And we have talked in previous shows about how, man, a surprising number of conservatives really like the show, and Kraft and Kajikawa think that's because you can see a lot of different things in there, and the intertextual nature of it, and all those different musical styles and borrowing from different places creates a strategic ambiguity that lets people see and interpret the show in a whole bunch of different ways, including conservative politicians. Kajikawa's conclusion is that using a whole bunch of different musical styles makes it an intertextual performance, which opens it to a bunch of different interpretations. That then appeals to both traditional Broadway audiences and traditional hip-hop audiences, and that's what contributes to the success. So that's first theme that Kajikawa talks about. Second one is the rags to riches story and the capitalism trap. Now, before we get going, it's worth rolling back and listening to our shows on neoliberalism. There's a bunch of that in Les Mis and whatever. And we've also talked about that in some of the Hamilton episodes. If you have listened to every episode of this show, I can't tell you how much I love you right now. But also, this is well-trodden territory. What is neoliberalism? Well, here's the 50-word version. Capitalism works for some people, but it can't work for everyone. Yes, you can come from having nothing to be number one on the pop charts, but there can only be one number one. And for everybody who makes it to number one, there are thousands of musicians who went for broke and didn't get anywhere. And that's a key contradiction at the heart of you need to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps hero narrative. Someone with nothing rises to the top through hard work and talent. That's a story we love to tell. And that's a story that is right at the heart of hip hop. But it's also a story that makes it so that systemic problems are brought out of focus or ignored or obscured or buried or maybe even erased. Is there economic inequality in the music industry? Oh boy. Yes, there is. Even the famous musicians get really mad. Even Weird Al Yankovic is mad at record companies or thinks that they try to rip you off all the time and that producers exploit artists and that most artists never make it anywhere. And the story about how, oh yeah, but I was the guy who was so good that it worked for me and it was always going to work for me. And what the neoliberal thing would say, well, it's true in the music industry, but it's also true in society that some people, and as in America today, undeniably, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. That's probably an outgrowth of capitalism. And so we need to come to grips with just telling poor people you need to work harder ignores the fact that no matter how hard everyone works, right, there's not going to be room at the top for everyone. Not everyone can succeed, and the system might be unfair or imbalanced. And so if you don't like capitalism, if you are a critic of neoliberalism, that's what you don't like. It's what you don't like about that pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and rags to riches hero narrative. But Hamilton himself clearly identified that, starting from the bottom theme as a hip-hop trope. Quote, Alexander Hamilton had much in common with famous rap artists such as Tupac Shakur and Notorious B.I.G. because he also rose from difficult circumstances on the strength of his words, end quote. Well, Kajikawa, this gets us back to that capitalism link. Quote, for these reasons, political scientist Lenser Spence characterizes gangster rap as a quintessentially neoliberal subgenre because it functions as an allegory for how Black people, whom the white founders actually regarded as unable to meet the demands of a democratic citizenship, might be redeemable as capitalist subjects after all. And then a quote that continues later. Thus, Hamilton's celebration of racial diversity without concern for economic justice reflects current tensions in politics and popular culture. If the musical's borrowing from hip-hop enables it to press for a more racially diverse sense of cultural citizenship, then it also reproduces some of the genre's own political contradiction. Mainstream rappers today celebrate Black wealth, but they tend to avoid critiquing the economic system that makes it difficult for more of their peers to rise up, end quote. And, part of that is you point to the successful Black people and say, hey, look, racism's gone, when most people of color still experience a whole bunch of racism. And JC, I gotta say, Colin Kaepernick took a stand against police violence against people of color. The recent ICE murders of people in their car sort of presses that issue. Jay-Z took over the Super Bowl halftime show and made a whole pile of money, but that was all an attempt to placate, make it okay that the National Football League could blackball Colin Kaepernick. And I think Jay-Z's got some stuff to answer for there. Or at least I do think it's fair to say the success of those Black artists, Jay-Z more than anyone, is being used as a reason to try to say, okay, racism is gone, and it clearly is not. And there's a direct link that is made to Obama. Speaking of Obama, Kajikawa writes, quote, his story, like those of numerous other rappers, redeems Blackness for capitalism and promises that anybody can make it to the top of American society if they possess the talent and the will to do so, end quote. So there's a lot of rappers who are now really, really rich. We are in the post-bling era. Maybe that means that they're mainstream. Maybe it means they've sold out. Maybe it means that they are neoliberal dupes, but it is a problem at the heart of hip-hop. Hip-hop is at the heart of the Hamilton the musical, and that neoliberal issue is right at the heart of Hamilton as well. We'll talk about how that all adds up to our evaluation show in a sec. Theme number 3 is about violence and misogyny, which are two themes of the hip-hop. Now, we learned from the outset, as I read you in that quote at the beginning, that some of the things about hip-hop music that trouble people the most are not present in Hamilton the musical. But just because, there aren't as many curse words, there's not as much overt reference to killing people, but some of those troubling aspects are there. Quote, Miranda's assertion that Hamilton embodies hip-hop illuminates how heroic individualism, rugged masculinity, and poetic self-invention underwrite narratives of the nation's birth, as well as the musical personas of numerous hip-hop stars. End quote. Okay, well, that rugged masculinity, that heroic individualism doesn't always leave a lot of room for females. And in fact, in the show Hamilton, they spend not very much time rapping and a lot more time singing traditionally. In the first act, there's that bar scene where Lawrence and I think Burr and Hamilton get together. They have some sexual bragging. They talk about some anti-cop things. They have the brash and bravado of outlaw characters. And Kajikawa explicitly links them to Michael Corleone and Tony Montana. These are not especially female empowering characters. And in this way, quote, This is from Kajikawa. Hamilton mirrors gender divisions within the mainstream rap music, end quote. Now, we've got a whole episode on women and how they play in Hamilton. I won't dwell on that too much, but it does press the question that hip hop can be misogynistic or it could be empowering. And the question that we are here to think about is whether or not Hamilton's use of hip hop is misogynistic or empowering to women. And my rough conclusion is that women could do more on the show, but the performers in this show really kill it. And those female characters resonate quite a bit and they don't come off as weak. And so I think that sort of redeems the show. But if you were criticizing the show saying the women don't really do as much as they could, you're not wrong about that. Now, beyond the question of misogyny, there's the overall question of political power. Loren's, in that bar scene I was talking about, he calls the British the cops, which is a pretty explicit connection to a common hip hop thing, especially things like NWA's F the Police thing. Now, if you read the academic literature, you would have no trouble believing that policing is racialized, that Black people are way more likely to be arrested than white people. They're more likely to get pulled over. They're more likely to get convicted. They're less likely to get good plea deals. Just the academic research on that is unequivocal, and it says that happens. And that is voiced in hip-hop music quite a bit, where it is clear that Black communities do not really trust police that much. And so that is I think that's what you would call a political statement, that there's a call within the hip-hop music to say these forces of the state are used not in neutral ways, but they are used to keep down people of color, that has been a historical function of the police. And I know there's a bunch of really good cops out there and a lot of people working really hard to improve that situation. But I do think that is the history of policing, especially in the South. In the Attica riots, the prisoners who were largely African-American rioted, and they were put down. Eventually, the riots were put down by the white police force. But the white police force, at the end of that, forced the prisoners to run around on broken glass and chanted the phrase white power as they did so. So I think there's just a racial element to policing. And I do think that a political statement that is very common in hip hop music is to challenge that. And it's right there in the hip hop, in that lyric of Loren's, which I do think shows, we had talked about what are the characteristics of hip hop? Well, it can have political content, but it doesn't have to. But that's pretty clear evidence that Hamilton, or that this show referencing the British as the police, is making a political statement there. But, quote, Miranda's prominent use of Notorious B.I.G.'s famous song about the unofficial rules of street-level drug dealing smuggles some of the most marginalized members of contemporary U.S. society into the heart of the founders' mythology, end quote. We had talked about that Notorious B.I.G., the 10 dueling commandments is a reference to 10 crack commandments. And that connection is definitely Miranda trying to say, hey, the revolutionary guys were a lot like the hip hop guys that I listen to all the time. Okay. Now, just to nerd out a little bit about political philosophy, the politics we think of as elections, but technically and really, politics is about power, who gets to make final decisions, who can compel other people to do what they say, who gets to write the laws. And at the end of the day, that the rubber hits the road about the ability to control violence, that if there's something happening and it's not fair, and you can resolve that with words and by changing laws in city council meetings or legislatures, that is one way that you can resolve differences. But at the end of the day, the people who have the power are the ones who can compel the behavior of others through violence. And that is linked to police versus criminal behavior, that if you are in power, you get to tell the police you get to use violence to stop those people from doing this. Now, most of the time, that's not problematic, right? Someone's committed a murder. You want the police to be able to go arrest them, and the police might have to use force doing that. All that is fine. But, if you were to read Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, you would say, but we know a lot of those laws are unjust, and hence a lot of that violence that is used is not justified. It's not fair. It's not advancing equality or justice or any of the things in the Constitution. And so in a lot of ways, to resist an unfair political system means to do something that the system is calling criminal. And that might subject you to violence, and maybe you will use violence back. So not all crime is political violence, but some of it really is. And a lot of people who are protesting will be subject to violence or might fight back against police. And a revolution is the use of violence for political change. That sometimes that is justified, sometimes that is not, right? At the end of the day, you have to be right. You have to be on the side of justice and truth. And some revolutions are and some revolutions are not. And some police power is indeed just protecting public safety, and some police power is just propping up a repressive state. All that is to say that people of color objecting to the police use of violence against them when it is not justified is a very political statement. And that is very much part of hip hop music. And that hip hop element is right there in that line in Hamilton. Well, so, all right, now we are done. Kajikawa has talked about violence, talked about misogyny, has talked about using all those different styles of music. What does it all add up to? Well, Kajikawa thinks it is a big net step forward, that hip hop has some good, it's got some bad, but what Kajikawa really likes is the intertextuality and how the show has political possibility. Here is the conclusion quote: "The musical and its cast recording represent a potent example of how politics and popular culture can inform one another, and how the combination of musical theater and hip hop can serve as a mirror and also perhaps as an inspiration for political struggle. Miranda's use of hip-hop as a lingua franca for the entire production is fundamental to Hamilton's political thrust, sounding out the distance between the United States ideals of liberty and justice for all and the ongoing realities," end quote. And I agree. I just think what Hamilton trying to say is like, well, we had this Constitution. It promised liberty and justice for everyone. And here we are 250 years ago, and we do not have those ideals of liberty and justice for all fully realized. My point is to tell the story of America then through the eyes of America now. And that overarching theme seeps in there. And so has it freed itself from all misogyny? No. Does the show, however, has some fantastic female performers who make it so that they are not perceived as weak? Yeah, for sure. Hip hop has the possibility to include politics, but doesn't necessarily. Does Hamilton include it? Yes, it definitely includes that political possibility. Does it use other non-hip hop styles? Yes. Is that the complete selling out that Platanis thinks it is? Well, no, not according to Kajikawa. Kajikawa thinks that mixing of musical genres makes the whole thing just more rich, more successful. And I guess I sort of agree with that. Okay, we are at the end here. Where did we land? What did we come to the conclusion about Hamilton and hip hop? We concluded that hip hop had some good and it has some bad. We've noticed that the songs in Hamilton are more musically inclined than the original Street Party origins that were, just kind of beatboxes and rapping. But hip hop evolved since then. And right at that epic peak of the bling era was when Lin Manuel Miranda was saying, okay, hey, I can use whole bunches of musical styles. I can include them there. Miranda's vision is the modern thing, and it seeks to be politically progressive. So it has to find a way to get the good parts of hip hop, which is the celebration of street culture and the political potential, and it has to contend with the bad parts, the misogyny and the celebration of violence. For some like Platanis, it just doesn't. It doesn't work. It fails. For some like Sievers, it succeeds because it raises the question of violence and confronts it. But for me, the biggest challenge is the neoliberal one. Both hip hop and Hamilton, the musical and Hamilton's life, are clearly a celebration of empowerment through material wealth. And success means you trade in your rags for your riches. Now, that's not all of the Hamilton story. But look, man, this dude founded the U.S. Treasury. He is pointed to as a capitalist. He himself was a capitalist. And please listen to, I think it's episode 3 of this series that talks about everything he did, all of his economic theories and what he did for the economy. So it is kind of central to Hamilton, right? To the life of Hamilton, to the story. If you're going to tell the story of Hamilton, this rags to riches thing and this linked capitalism is central to the story. What do we make of that? Well, if you don't like capitalism, you're just not going to like Hamilton. You're not going to like him. You're not going to like the musical. If you don't like Barack Obama, you also aren't going to like Hamilton, the musical, for sure. Right? Obama's the guy, work within the system guy, succeed working with others. Miranda was close, and Obama were very fond of each other. Obama loved the show. And if you think Obama was too centrist and you wanted to be more radical and you think Obama kind of blew it that way, then you're going to hate Hamilton, the musical. But for me, and I'd mentioned this in the past, we've talked about the neoliberal question in the past. For me, What you really have to do is balance the negatives with the parts of the show that are obviously inclusive. As Kajikawa pointed out, as the country moved to the right, when Trump got elected in 2016 and we became a much more conservative government, the show didn't change, but the country did, and that made the show way more subversive. And I think that's how you evaluate things. If you plant your flag on the side of inclusion and try to expand the roles for people of color, it's fair if others want to challenge you to say that you missed your mark. But you also have to come to terms with what the show did accomplish. If that show is like, we're for inclusion, and you say you're not inclusive enough, and then the government starts saying, inclusion is bad, we should stomp that out. In fact, our U.S. federal government right now is removing the memorials to Black war heroes. These people who were not selected because of their race, they were selected because they were war heroes. They did put their lives on the line to make the country safer for everybody else. We recognize them. The government's getting rid of them because they hate inclusion so much, and they're worried that we don't want to see that much inclusion for whatever reason. Okay, well, now the show stands for something. It stands for that inclusion, and maybe it didn't go far enough, but I think you have to give it credit for what it did do. And if this is one of the things that you can point to as, is inclusion good or bad? Well, take a look at this show. It rewrote Broadway history, and it did so by being inclusive. I mean, that's a big thing, a big cultural event that counteracts the attempts to get rid of inclusion. So I land where Kajikawa did. The show moved the needle on what it needs to do, and that's a lot. The inclusive part of it is more important than maybe not being completely true to what original hip hop would have wanted to do. All right, and so I think that is my the final thought that I have about Hamilton and hip hop. That hip hop's got some problems. Those problems the show had to deal with. The show did deal with it, not always successfully, but on balance in a way that definitely leaves the audience with a more well-rounded sense that the founding of the country is not just the story of great white men, that the quest for equality and justice is the quest for everyone, and that the battle for that is constant, that we've been trying to get to that more inclusive, perfect world for 250 years, and we're closer now than we were then, but we still got a ways to go. And I think that this show and its use of hip hop was able to take some of those political questions, put them out there, and help move us in that direction. Okay, so that will do it for this episode. We have one more show on Hamilton. Look out for those quizzes. The next up, our 12th and final Hamilton episode. The United States is a major global power, and it has been, at least since World War II. And we trace all of our success, the United States from today, back to our economic power and to our Constitution. And Alexander Hamilton, more than anybody else, played a role in both of these things. And we have told that story about how Hamilton contributed to the economic power in our earlier episodes in this series, but there is a largely untold story about the role that Alexander Hamilton played in the creation and the passage of the U.S. Constitution. And I got to tell you, it is totally nuts, right? Yeah, we were so close to never having had a constitution, and there were a huge number of obstacles to be overcome, and nobody was more central to getting past those obstacles and making the unlikely victories that had to happen for the Constitution to get passed than Alexander Hamilton. And you are going to learn some things about what he did and how he did it on the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I will see you then.